I see a lot of people on my social media comment that they didn't know about the topics I cover. Welcome back to Here Queer and Maple Syrup, a look at queer Canadian history, an extension of my TikTok series. I'm Jacob, your host. Let's chat. Today is a shorter, special episode in honor of Pride Month. Because of the number of people who comment on my videos and talk about how they didn't know, I felt it might be interesting to talk about how I got into queer Canadian history. I didn't actually start into this the same way as others did. I didn't watch a TV series or a movie or read a book that talked about queer Canadian history, mostly because there has yet to be a TV series or a movie about queer Canadian history, but I'll get to that a bit later. I'll go back to a bit further when I realized I was bi, because it's actually kind of relevant. I was confused between the ages of 12 and 19. When I was about 20, in around 2015, I realized I was bi. But I didn't really feel much of a connection to the queer community yet. I had convinced myself that I was straight for so long that I felt like I couldn't be a part of the community. This was around the time I started including queerness in a less stereotypical way in my writing, since I had been writing for about 3 years at this point. I had been creating TV concepts, and looking back, there may have been strong elements at their core, but there were a number of plot holes and inconsistencies. But I digress. In about 2018, I decided to develop an anthology series about key events from Canadian history. But I wanted to get away from the typical topics like Confederation and the October Crisis, because they're a bit overdone at this point, honestly. I started developing the first season, and once I had done that, I thought it would be cool to cover an event from queer Canadian history for the second season. And I chose Operation Soap, the 1981 Toronto bathhouse raids. I didn't realize at the time, but that was going to start a number of rabbit holes that my ADHD brain would take me down over the next few years. And this was before I knew I had ADHD. Once I started developing season 2, I realized as I was learning more about other marginalized communities that maybe season 1 wasn't my story to tell, as it was about Viola Desmond, regardless of the intention. I opted to scrap the first season and just make a mini-series about Operation Soap, since, as a queer person, it partially is my story to tell. It was during this time that I started down my first of many rabbit holes. So many rabbit holes. I started pitching the series around and caught the eye of a Toronto producer who was very interested. I developed the series further under him, and he pitched it around, even getting Out TV on board. But ultimately it ended up in development hell when it got rejected by major Canadian broadcasters. In 2022, I moved to the UK for my master's, and during one of the first meetings, we were presented with our creative project guidance, our thesis. Now, this was a master's in musical theater, so it was a 30-minute solo performance accompanied by a written portion. One of the pieces of guidance was that we had to have academic backing for our creative project. It couldn't just be us on stage doing a work of fiction that we liked. We did lots of academic research to defend our thesis, just in a different way than a traditional one. My initial instinct was to do authentic queer intimacy on camera and do a short film. However, that idea fell through. I ended up going with my backup plan, which ended up being my final project. My thesis was telling untold stories from queer Canadian history through queer anthropology and solo performance. At one point, while developing my creative project, the producer came back to me and said that he had spoken with a producer who had worked with a major streamer. That streaming producer said that my project was, quote, very Canadian, and that it wasn't, quote, globally ready. I honestly still have no idea what that was supposed to mean. Most queer American stories are very American, yet we still have an oversaturation of those stories. This series was never supposed to be for Americans or Brits. It was for Canadians, so we could actually start to recognize our own queer history. In any case, while I was researching my thesis, I decided to talk about the AIDS crisis in Canada because, let's face it, most stories from queer Canadian history are untold, so I really had to narrow that scope down and just pick a couple. In the final performance of my creative project, I had a friend at the door saying, "Welcome to the Netflix testing audience for a new TV show about queer Canadian history." During my Q&A with the panel afterward, they asked how that was connected to my performance, and I explained what the streaming producer had said. It was a jab at streamers as a whole, not just Netflix. People just know what Netflix is. In December 2022, I went home for the holidays and decided to do some research at the Nova Scotia Archives. The archivist on duty suggested I look up Eric Smith. I was horrified by what I read. One of the particular facts of the case that struck me and still baffles me to this day, and I've been researching this particular case for 4 years almost, is that I was unable to find out what happened to the medical secretary who violated so many laws by outing his diagnosis to the small community. The more I researched queer Canadian history, the more my creative project became fleshed out. The next few months flew by, and before I knew it, I was in the studio preparing my performance. I still remember doing the performance and hearing that single gasp in a room where you could hear a pin drop. As I said, of course, playing a character who was present at the Toronto Bathhouse raids on the 5th of February 1981. Something along the lines of, when they held us in the showers, one of the cops looked up at the pipes and said to one of his friends, "Too bad we can't hook those up to gas." And to make matters worse, one of my friends who was standing there was the son of 2 Holocaust survivors. Those words were actually said by a cop who was holding queer men in the showers that February night. I found that quote by accident. I was just listening to an interview with someone who was present that night, and I had to go back and listen a second and third time because I genuinely thought I misheard what was said. Safe to say that I did not mishear anything. Over my next 2 years in London, the topic of queer Canadian history would come up occasionally, but it would mostly fall along the wayside, except when I would get the inspiration and work on adapting my miniseries about Operation Soap into a feature screenplay. I had toyed with the idea of doing a TikTok history series specifically about queer Canadian history for a while, but it wasn't until the end of December 2025 when I made a video that went viral. Well, For my account, it went viral with almost 15,000 views in 24 hours. In the video, I was talking about Canadian media and heated rivalry. In any case, over the next few days, I kept thinking about how people responded to that video and realized that I could fill a bit of a gap on TikTok, as queer Canadian history creators are not numerous at all on the app. And then on the 2nd of January 2026, I started down the path of being a queer Canadian history creator on TikTok. After I posted that first video, which was about John Watkins and Operation Rock Bottom, I had played around with the idea of doing a full-length podcast and even did a couple of trial recordings, but got distracted because ADHD. And I didn't touch the idea again until a large number of people started commenting on my posts in early March, asking specifically for longer form content. Honestly, I love doing this. I've always had a passion for history, and I always say that if I wasn't a performer, I'd work in the history world. Archives, archaeology, that kind of thing. Queer history on the whole isn't always easy to research because of a lack of preservation, but also because it's just hard to read about sometimes. I've read things that I have to step away from for a few minutes and just breathe. And it is once again Pride Month. While we have so much work to do to ensure that everyone in our community feels safe and valued, we've accomplished a lot. And that's definitely something to be proud of. The work we do in advocating for our community, as is the case with every marginalized group, is never truly finished. But we definitely have our successes, and those are certainly worth celebrating.